Today, we're diving into a really fascinating analysis, one that argues that Donald Trump's foreign policy, which so often looks like pure chaos, is actually a deliberate, calculated plan to completely reshape the world. I mean, you've seen the headlines, right? The bizarre push to buy Greenland, the constant friction with some of our oldest allies. It's almost always painted as impulsive, even erratic. But the source material for this explainer asks a pretty provocative question. What if it's not random at all? What if it's all part of a plan?
So here's the core idea. These actions are a purposeful stress test. The goal is to smoke out who America's real friends are and who they aren't, all in preparation for a potential future showdown. The point isn't to create disorder, it's to forge a whole new set of alliances for a completely new era.
All right, so to really get this new doctrine, we have to first take a look at the old one, the system that's been running global affairs for most of our lives. For about 75 years, the world ran on this rules-based international order. The whole theory was that big institutions like the UN and the IMF, run by international officials, would keep everything stable and stop major wars from happening. Well, that was the theory anyway.
But this analysis argues that the whole system had two fatal flaws. First, it handed a ton of power over to these global bureaucrats, often sidelining a country's own right to make its own decisions. And second, and this is a huge one, the source claims it completely failed to deal with China, which basically joined all the clubs just to game the system for its own benefit. Stealing technology, messing with currencies, and hollowing out Western manufacturing.
And then came COVID. The pandemic was really the final straw. It laid bare just how fragile our supply chains were and showed how much influence Beijing had over some of these international bodies. The analysis we're covering says this just drained the last bit of legitimacy from the old order, leaving it as a hollow shell that really only served a global elite, what the source calls the Davos class, and of course, the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay, so if the old system is basically dead, what's supposed to replace it? Well, this brings us to the new doctrine that's being put into practice.
And when you put the two worldviews side by side, the difference is, well, it's night and day. The old way was all about multilateralism, about these processes run by global bureaucrats. This new doctrine, as it's described here, is all about one-on-one deals based purely on national interest. It's not about signing feel-good treaties anymore. It's about getting verifiable commitments. You don't just get to join the club, you have to prove you're actually on the team. And all of this brings us to the one single question that's driving this entire strategy. According to the source, pretty much every foreign policy move is designed to answer this one thing. In a really high-stakes conflict with China, let's say over Taiwan, who's actually in and who's out? When the chips are down, who can you really truly count on?
And you can see this test being run all over the world. Japan and South Korea, they're being tested on defense spending and trade. NATO allies are being pressured to finally meet their commitments. Even that whole thing with Greenland and Denmark, that's framed as a test of sovereignty and who controls the Arctic. Seizing oil assets in Venezuela, that's a signal that the Western Hemisphere is not up for grabs. It's all supposedly part of the same playbook. Now, to really understand how this all works, the analysis uses a really powerful case study. It's a hypothetical scenario, but it involves America's neighbor to the north, Canada, and a public figure who, in this view, perfectly represents that old guard. Meet Mark Carney. His resume, as presented by the source, is just a perfect storm of the old guard. I mean, look at this. Goldman Sachs, governor of 2 different central banks, a UN envoy, a board member at the World Economic Forum. In this analysis, he is the living, breathing embodiment of that old Davos-run world order. He is the system. So in this hypothetical timeline, Carney becomes Canada's Prime Minister. He wins an election running on anti-Trump nationalism. And then what happens? What's his first major visit to a rival power? It's not Washington, it's Beijing. He signs a deal there. And then just a few days later, he's up on stage at Davos criticizing American pressure tactics. You can see the pattern. But this is the moment the analysis points to as the ultimate giveaway. In this hypothetical, speaking in Beijing, standing next to Xi Jinping, Carney says this phrase with these very deliberate pauses: the new world order. To invoke that incredibly loaded phrase in that specific location is presented as an absolutely unmistakable signal.
See, this isn't just seen as simple diplomacy. It's viewed as a classic globalist play. You try to balance between the big powers, you position your country as a middle power, and, most importantly, you refuse to definitively pick a side. It's an attempt to keep that old game of multilateral chess alive. But in this new doctrine, that's the entire problem. Trying to play both sides is the same thing as declaring you're not a reliable partner. In a world that is demanding a clear choice, hedging your bets is seen as failing the test. And so Canada, under this hypothetical leadership, chose the fantasy of neutrality over the new reality. So let's zoom out a little. Why does this interpretation of events matter so much, and why is it so different from what we typically hear from most experts? Well, the source uses a specific term to describe the foreign policy establishment, the blob. The argument is that this entire ecosystem, all the experts, the diplomats, the think tanks, is deeply invested in the old rules-based order. Because, well, that's the system that gives them all their power and influence. And this whole system keeps itself going through what the source calls a revolving door. People move from a job at the State Department to a cushy position at a think tank, then they go speak at a global forum like Davos, and then they circle right back into a new government job, all while reinforcing the exact same worldview. And that leads to this conclusion from the analysis. When the establishment frames these actions as chaos, it's not some objective assessment. It's a defense mechanism. They are defending their own power structure from something that threatens it. The chaos narrative is a tool to discredit a global realignment that could make them irrelevant. So, here is the bottom line, according to the analysis we've just explored. The old order, it's gone. From now on, alliances aren't about having a membership card to a club like NATO. They're about tangible, verifiable commitments. And the source argues the single biggest choice every nation will have to make is whether they align with free societies or hedge their bets with Beijing. In this view, there is no more middle ground. And that brings us to the final critical question. If this analysis is right, and the world really is going through its biggest realignment since 1945, forcing every single nation to choose a side, who stands where? That's the question that could define the next century.